He is paralyzed. Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed brutally beat down Paul Heyman on WWE SmackDown. This is absolutely unforgivable and I am sick to my stomach. Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed just committed the most despicable, cowardly, and potentially career-ending assault in WWE history by brutalizing Paul Heyman, a 58-year-old non-wrestler who was defenseless and helpless to the point where early reports suggest he may have suffered spinal injuries that could leave him paralyzed, and I am beyond furious because WWE allowed two of their strongest athletes to attack an elderly man who has never claimed to be a fighter in a segment so disturbing that it crosses every line of decency and makes me question whether WWE cares at all about the safety and well-being of their non-wrestling personnel. What makes this even more horrifying is that Paul Heyman is not just any manager, he's a legend, a Hall of Famer, someone who's given decades of his life to this business, and watching him being stretchered out with a neck brace while his body lay motionless is an image that will haunt wrestling fans forever and raises serious questions about whether WWE has gone too far in their pursuit of shocking television. I'm devastated for Paul Heyman and his family. I'm disgusted by Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed for attacking someone who couldn't defend himself, and I'm about to break down exactly what happened in this horrific assault, why these two monsters should be immediately fired from WWE, what this means for Roman Reigns and the Bloodline's response, and whether Paul Heyman will ever be able to return to WWE after suffering what doctors are calling potentially life-altering injuries. Let me describe this sickening attack in detail because everyone needs to understand the severity and the brutality of what Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed did to Paul Heyman on SmackDown. Paul was in the ring cutting a promo on behalf of Roman Reigns, doing what he does best, using his words as weapons, building heat, creating storylines. He was standing there in his suit, microphone in hand, completely defenseless and vulnerable. Then Bron Breakker's music hit. The crowd initially popped because Breakker is over with fans despite being a heel, but the pop turned to confusion when Bronson Reed's music hit immediately after. These two aren't typically aligned, so seeing them come out together was our first sign something terrible was about to happen. Paul's face showed immediate fear. He started backing up, started trying to talk his way out of the situation like he's done hundreds of times before. "Gentlemen, let's talk about this. There's no need for violence. I'm just a humble advocate for the tribal chief. Whatever issues you have, we can resolve them diplomatically." But Bron and Bronson weren't interested in talking. They entered the ring from opposite sides, trapping Paul between them with nowhere to escape. Paul tried to slide out of the ring, but Bron grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back. The look of absolute terror on Paul's face was heartbreaking. This man knew something bad was about to happen and was completely helpless to stop it. Bron threw the first punch, a stiff right hand that dropped Paul immediately. Paul wasn't trained to take bumps. He's not a wrestler. He's a 58-year-old manager whose body can't absorb that kind of punishment. But Bron didn't care. He picked Paul up and threw him into the corner where Bronson Reed was waiting. What happened next was sickening. Bronson Reed, all 330 pounds of him, charged across the ring and crushed Paul with a corner splash. The impact was devastating. You could see Paul's body go limp from the force. But they weren't done. Not even close. Bron dragged Paul's limp body to the center of the ring and delivered a gorilla press power slam that nearly broke Paul in half. Then Bronson climbed to the second rope and delivered his tsunami splash, 330 pounds crashing down on Paul's defenseless body from height. The sound of the impact made everyone in the arena gasp in horror. Paul wasn't moving. His eyes were open but vacant. His arms and legs weren't responding. Medical staff rushed to the ring immediately, and you could see the panic on their faces. They were frantically checking Paul's neck and spine, calling for a stretcher, waving the dreaded X symbol that means this is real and serious. They fitted Paul with a neck brace, carefully secured him to a backboard, and loaded him onto the stretcher with extreme caution. As they wheeled him up the ramp, Paul still wasn't moving anything below his neck. The crowd was silent, not booing, not cheering, just stunned horror at what they'd witnessed. Let me ask you right now in the comments, is there any justification for Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed attacking a 58-year-old non-wrestler like Paul Heyman, or should both of them be immediately fired from WWE for this assault? Because I don't see how anyone defends this. Now let's talk about the medical implications of what happened to Paul Heyman, because early reports are terrifying. According to sources close to the situation, Paul was rushed to a local medical facility where doctors conducted emergency scans of his neck and spine. The preliminary diagnosis is devastating: potential spinal cord compression at multiple vertebrae, severe trauma to the cervical spine that could affect nerve function, temporary or possibly permanent loss of sensation and motor control below the neck, and a prognosis that's described as extremely concerning by the medical team treating him. The word paralyzed is being whispered in medical circles, though doctors are being cautious about making definitive statements until swelling goes down and they can fully assess the damage. But the fact that Paul showed no movement in his extremities after the attack, the fact that he required emergency spinal immobilization, the fact that doctors are consulting with specialists about potential surgery, all of this points to injuries far more severe than anything we should ever see in professional wrestling. Paul Heyman is 58 years old. His body doesn't heal like a 25-year-old wrestler's body. Spinal injuries at his age can be permanent. Even if he regains some function, he may never be the same person he was before this attack. We could be looking at months or years of physical therapy, surgeries, rehabilitation, and all of that assuming the best case scenario where Paul regains function at all. The worst case scenario, the one nobody wants to think about but we have to acknowledge, is that Paul Heyman may be permanently paralyzed from this attack. He may never walk again. He may never be able to perform the basic functions we all take for granted. His career in wrestling would obviously be over, but more importantly, his quality of life could be permanently diminished because two wrestlers decided attacking a defenseless manager was good television. That's not entertainment. That's not compelling storytelling. That's assault of an elderly person that resulted in potentially life-altering injuries. And WWE should be ashamed that they allowed this segment to happen. Trivia question for the Wrestling Newsletter family: how many years has Paul Heyman been involved in professional wrestling, and what was the name of his original wrestling promotion before ECW? Let's see who knows Paul's legendary history. Here's what makes me absolutely furious: where was security? Where was WWE management? How did Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed get to the ring, trap Paul Heyman, and execute this prolonged assault without anyone stopping them before Paul was critically injured? This represents a complete failure of WWE's duty to protect their employees, especially non-wrestling personnel who have no ability to defend themselves. WWE has security personnel at every show. They have producers and agents monitoring segments. They have management watching everything happen. Yet somehow, nobody intervened until after Paul was already paralyzed? That's either complete incompetence or deliberate negligence, and either option is unacceptable. If WWE knew this segment was going to involve physical contact with Paul Heyman, they should have had safety measures in place. They should have had medical staff standing by. They should have rehearsed the segment to ensure Paul wouldn't actually be injured. If this was supposed to be a worked shoot that went wrong, that's a failure of preparation and coordination. But if WWE deliberately booked this segment to be as brutal as it was for shock value if they knew Paul would be put at risk and did it anyway for television ratings, that's criminal negligence. That's prioritizing entertainment over human safety in the most reckless way imaginable. WWE needs to conduct a full investigation into how this happened, who approved this segment, and what safety protocols failed. There need to be consequences for everyone involved in allowing a 58-year-old non-wrestler to be put in this position. And most importantly, WWE needs to ensure this never happens again. Should WWE's security and management be held accountable for failing to protect Paul Heyman, or was this attack impossible to prevent? Comment whether you think WWE is responsible for what happened. Let's discuss Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed's motivations, because understanding why they did this is crucial, though I struggle to imagine any justification that makes attacking Paul acceptable. Based on recent SmackDown storylines, the most likely explanation is that Breakker and Reed were trying to send a message to Roman Reigns by attacking his special counsel. This is classic cowardly heel behavior. Can't beat the tribal chief directly, so you attack the people around him who can't fight back. Paul Heyman was an easy target precisely because he's not a wrestler. He couldn't defend himself. He couldn't fight back. He was completely vulnerable, which made him the perfect victim for two bullies trying to make a statement. But here's the problem with that motivation: it makes Bron and Bronson look like cowards, not tough guys. Real warriors fight other warriors. They challenge opponents who can defend themselves. They prove their toughness through competitive matches, not by attacking defenseless managers. By targeting Paul Heyman, Bron and Bronson actually made themselves look weaker, not stronger. They proved they're afraid to face Roman directly, so they resort to attacking his 58-year-old manager. That's not impressive. That's pathetic. WWE might try to spin this as Bron and Bronson being ruthless or willing to do whatever it takes. But there's a difference between being ruthless within wrestling's moral framework and being cruel bullies who attack vulnerable people. Attacking Paul crosses that line into territory that makes these characters unlikable in a way that doesn't generate good heel heat, it generates go-away heat where fans don't want to see them at all. What could possibly justify Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed attacking Paul Heyman? Should they be positioned as ruthless heels or cowardly bullies? Comment your take on how WWE should frame their characters after this. Here's my controversial take that will make people angry: WWE should fire Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed both in kayfabe and in reality for what they did to Paul Heyman. In kayfabe, attacking a non-wrestler to this extent with these consequences should result in immediate termination. No suspension, no fine, fired, with storylines built around them trying to get their jobs back or seeking revenge on WWE for punishing them. But I'd go further. I think WWE should seriously consider actual consequences for both performers for participating in a segment that resulted in such serious, even if worked, injuries to a non-wrestling employee. Even if this was all planned and coordinated, the optics of two massive athletes brutalizing an elderly man are terrible for WWE's image. It makes wrestling look barbaric and cruel rather than athletic entertainment. I know some will say, but it's all a work, it's just storyline. Paul knew what he was signing up for. But even in storyline context, there need to be boundaries about what's acceptable to portray on television. Attacking defenseless elderly people and leaving them paralyzed crosses a line that shouldn't be crossed regardless of whether it's real or not. Wrestling has spent decades trying to be taken seriously as legitimate entertainment rather than lowbrow violence. Segments like this Paul Heyman attack set that progress back by making wrestling look like trashy television that exploits human suffering for ratings. WWE should be better than this. If WWE truly cares about Paul Heyman's well-being and not just using his injury for storyline purposes, they would make an example of Breakker and Reed by firing them, at least in kayfabe, to show that attacking non-wrestlers has severe consequences. Anything less sends the message that WWE doesn't actually care about protecting their people. Controversial question: should Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed be fired, in storyline or reality, for attacking Paul Heyman, or is that too extreme? This will divide the audience. Now let's talk about Roman Reigns' inevitable response, because Roman's reaction to his special counsel being paralyzed will define his character going forward. Roman has positioned himself as the head of the table, the leader who protects his family and his people. Paul Heyman is one of Roman's closest confidants, his advisor, his advocate. An attack on Paul is an attack on Roman. So Roman's response needs to be devastating and immediate. Roman should be cutting the most intense, threatening promo of his career, promising to destroy Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed for what they did. Roman should be calling for their heads, demanding they be fired, threatening to refuse to work until WWE gives him sanctioned opportunities to get revenge. But Roman's response also needs to show vulnerability. Roman should be visiting Paul in the hospital, showing genuine emotion and concern for his friend's well-being. We need to see Roman as more than just the cold, calculating tribal chief. We need to see the human underneath who's devastated by what happened to someone he cares about. This could be a character-defining moment for Roman where he shows depth and complexity we rarely see. But it requires WWE to commit to that emotional storytelling rather than just using Paul's injury as an excuse for Roman to have angry confrontations in big matches. The key is that Roman's revenge needs to feel earned and satisfying when it comes. Bron and Bronson crossed the ultimate line by attacking Paul. Roman's retribution needs to be equally severe, maybe a handicap match where Roman destroys both of them, maybe individual matches where Roman systematically breaks them both, maybe something even more creative. Whatever WWE does, Roman's response needs to make Breakker and Reed regret they ever touched Paul Heyman. Anything less would make Roman look weak for not properly avenging his special counsel. How should Roman Reigns respond to Paul Heyman's paralysis? Immediate violent revenge? Emotional vulnerability? Demanding Bron and Bronson be fired? Give me your booking ideas for Roman's response. Here's something nobody is talking about: the legal ramifications in both kayfabe and potentially reality. In kayfabe, Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed committed aggravated assault on a 58-year-old man that resulted in severe bodily harm and potential permanent disability. That's a felony that should involve police, criminal charges, and civil lawsuits. Paul Heyman should be pressing criminal charges. He should be suing Bron, Bronson, and WWE itself for failing to provide a safe working environment. He should be demanding that both attackers be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That would make the storyline feel real and have actual stakes beyond just wrestling matches. But WWE rarely explores those legal consequences because it's complicated and requires sustained attention to detail. More likely, they'll just move forward with standard wrestling revenge without acknowledging that what happened would result in serious criminal charges in any real-world context. And from a real legal perspective, even though this is just wrestling, if Paul Heyman actually suffered serious spinal injuries during this segment, there could be legitimate lawsuits against WWE for putting a non-wrestler in a position where he could be severely injured. WWE has a duty of care to all their employees, and allowing a 58-year-old manager to be in a segment with physical contact that results in paralysis could constitute negligence. I'm not saying Paul would or should sue WWE, I'm saying that the possibility exists, and WWE should be very careful about how they handle both the storyline and the real medical situation to avoid potential legal exposure. Should Paul Heyman press criminal charges against Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed in storyline, or should this be settled purely through wrestling revenge? Comment whether WWE should explore legal consequences. Let's address the moral question of whether WWE should have aired this segment at all, regardless of storyline considerations. Television is powerful. What we see on screen affects how people think and behave. When WWE shows two massive athletes brutalizing a defenseless 58-year-old man and leaving him paralyzed, what message does that send? Does it glorify violence against the elderly? Does it normalize attacking people who can't defend themselves? Does it teach younger viewers that this kind of brutality is entertaining rather than horrifying? These are questions WWE should have asked before airing this segment. I understand wrestling involves violence. I understand heels do terrible things to generate heat. But there are lines that shouldn't be crossed, and I believe attacking non-wrestlers to the point of paralysis crosses that line. WWE could have generated heat for Bron and Bronson in countless other ways that didn't involve putting Paul Heyman in this position. They could have had Bron and Bronson attack actual wrestlers from the bloodline. They could have had them destroy Roman's car or vandalize his locker room. They could have created tension and conflict without involving a 58-year-old manager who can't take bumps safely. But instead, WWE chose the most shocking, most disturbing option, and now Paul Heyman is potentially paralyzed as a result. Even if this is entirely a work and Paul is fine, even if he returns to television in a few weeks with no lasting effects, the image of a 58-year-old man being stretched out paralyzed is something you can't unsee. That imagery has consequences beyond just the immediate storyline. WWE has a responsibility to consider the broader impact of what they show on television. Not everything that generates shock value is worth doing. Sometimes restraint and good taste should trump the desire for viral moments and social media buzz. Did WWE cross a moral line by airing Paul Heyman's paralysis angle, or is this just compelling heel work? Comment whether you think this segment was appropriate for television. Here's my final analysis before I need your thoughts. The attack on Paul Heyman by Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed is either WWE's most despicable segment in years that crosses every line of decency, or it's the beginning of an intensely personal storyline that will lead to satisfying revenge if WWE handles it properly. If Paul Heyman is legitimately injured, WWE should be facing serious questions about how they allowed this to happen and whether entertainment value is worth putting non-wrestlers at this kind of risk. If this is entirely a work, WWE needs to deliver immediate consequences and satisfying revenge that justifies putting Paul through this storyline and subjecting fans to such disturbing imagery. Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed should face severe punishment, whether termination, suspension, or being destroyed by Roman Reigns in the most brutal matches of their careers. They crossed the ultimate line by attacking a defenseless legend, and there need to be consequences that make their actions meaningful rather than just another shocking TV moment. Paul Heyman deserves better than being used as a plot device to generate heel heat. He's a legend who's given his life to this business. Watching him stretchered out potentially paralyzed is heartbreaking regardless of whether it's real or worked. WWE owes Paul and owes fans proper handling of this storyline with emotional depth and satisfying conclusions. The wrestling world is praying Paul Heyman recovers fully and quickly. We're demanding Bron and Bronson face appropriate consequences. And we're watching to see if WWE respects the severity of what they portrayed or if they'll just move on to the next storyline without proper follow-through. If you made it through this entire breakdown of wrestling's most disturbing attack, you're incredible, and I need you to do 3 critical things. First, smash the like button if you're praying for Paul Heyman's recovery and demanding consequences for Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed. Second, leave detailed comments answering all my questions. Should they be fired? How should Roman respond? Did WWE cross a moral line? What happens next? Third, subscribe to Wrestling Newsletter and hit that bell because I'll be covering every update on Paul's condition and this story's development. This is the most serious situation in wrestling right now. Don't miss any updates.